In this video, now I've finished reviewing in a different key, I wanted to talk about Uta Frith, and Uta Frith had done a video which I saw, I think it was on YouTube, or was it The New Scientist? I think it's The New Scientist. New Scientist, she'd done a video. Yeah, it's The New Scientist video interview, and it was all about autism and mentalizing. So I'm just going to go through basically what she said, because I thought a lot of it was quite interesting. So Uta Frith says that autism itself is actually not rooted in difficulties mentalizing. It's not rooted in difficulties mentalizing, which is interesting because people often assume it is, but it actually isn't. For particular difficulties in social communication, that's only one aspect of autism, and this arguably involves difficulties in mentalizing. But it's a theory only, and it's an idea, she says, that still deserves study and it needs to be refined. And this might only be true for a small subgroup of autistics. So it might not actually be true that mentalising as a deficit actually affects every single autistic person, because people often treat mentalising as though it affects every single autistic person, as though it's somehow a unifying theory of autism. And it actually isn't. Uta Frith was very clear about that. I think people have misinterpreted it. Yeah, because it only affects one particular area of autism and not in all cases. So it doesn't explain the whole of autism anyway. The whole idea of mentalising was developed in the 1980s. And this was because language in some autistic people, in the more kind of classic presentation, was very delayed in development in all the early cases. And she talks about how all social encounters involve an intentional stance. So someone wants to tell you something, and autistics are not taking an intentional stance. They can't know because they can't know something that someone else hasn't seen. And then she talks about the Sally Ann test. I won't go into that now. You can Google it if you like, but that's like the classic kind of test that's often used in autism. But at age 4 to 5, autistics were getting the Sally Ann test, a classic test of mentalising. They were getting it wrong. But a little later, it was found that as they got older, they also could solve this task, and they passed the task, but with a delay of 5 years. So eventually they did manage to pass the test, but with just very, very delayed. And they might have solved the task differently. But there's still an open question. The mentalising theory does not explain autism. It explains only that one facet of autism. Now there's a different feature, a non-social feature, and this is observed in the ability to do jigsaw puzzles upside down and finding hidden figures. But again, not all autistic people can do that, clearly. I can't. I really suck at jigsaws. And she talks about this as a processing style which is completely normally distributed. So this is a normally distributed processing style. But it will probably only apply to a subgroup of autistics. So again, like a mentalising thing, it doesn't apply to all autistics. Not to all autistic people. But it is connected to savant abilities. And this probably has a completely different genetic underpinning compared to the social communication side. Two different genetic contributions. Like, it's often known as the fractionated triad, by the way. And the differences seem to be connectivity between the major hubs of the brain involved in mentalising in autistics. Or at least some autistics, because it's still a theory and there's very weak evidence. And she also talks about how all scanning data is group data, so brain scan data is groups data. And she says you can't detect an individual autistic via a scan. It's all to do with averages. And she also talks about the risks of pathologising completely useful personality variants via a cultural meme, the spread of Asperger's, and she would call them autistic-like. I'm not quite sure what she means by that. She also talks about how the bar has become too low, and that it has been diluted. She says that if you can say you have difficulties making friends, and a special hobby, it's enough to think that they could be autistic, but in fact, it's not enough, as you could non-specifically find these things in a large proportion of people who are just part of normal personality variations. I kind of agree with her there, though. And I think that's why you have to be a lot of these traits do occur in like typical people, but obviously in autism, if there's genuine autism going on, it's far more than that. But yeah, that's why you have to be careful in diagnosing autism. She says it needed to be expanded for research, but she says, but maybe it went a step too far, and because she talked about the fact there's no objective marker for autism. There are cognitive phenotype patterns that underlie the behaviour, and she says it's time to break up this huge spectrum. She says phenotypes are not subjective. Yeah, some basic, I suppose phenotypes are more objective, I suppose. Yeah, she talks about the problems with self-report, but she says there's something that could be verified by various psychological tests. And then she talks about how there might be different types of autism. She says one pattern is very easy to see, and this group is diagnosed very early, before the age of 5, for example 3 to 5. And she says another group is diagnosed after age 10 or even after age 15. And she said these are already very different groups. She says the early diagnosed autistics have severe neurodevelopmental disorders, language disorder and intellectual disability. I'm not actually sure that always applies, by the way. The late diagnosed, she says, have good language. She says in the early diagnosed group you can also have subgroups, and she also talks about how the late diagnosed group is more and more females, but not in the early diagnosed group, which is 3 to 1 male to female. So the ratio in the early diagnosed group is stable, it hasn't changed. And she says, is all of this autism? She says it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. She says it's something else that at the moment doesn't. It might be something else that at the moment doesn't have a name. Maybe there is some other condition that describes some of these people that we haven't commonly named. Autism wasn't diagnosed before the 1940s as the name didn't exist, but the people existed, she said. So maybe there's another name for some of these people that doesn't yet exist yet. Clinging to autism diagnosis, she says, ignores profound autism. Late diagnosed women, she says, have wonderful communication and no difficulty in language, but she says they still want to be autistic and labelled it such, but they have everything, she says. I'm not entirely sure who she's talking about, maybe people like Melanie Sykes, I don't know. She wonders if they would be much better recognised if one looked at what really their problems actually were. She said it could be called type 2 autism, but why not find a name that actually suitable and recognises that this is a different thing, so it might not be autism? How can you ever falsify a diagnosis if masking is a thing? So the problem of masking and circularity. Late diagnosed people had a perfectly unremarkable childhood, she says. They developed quite normally. Well, not in my case. I won't go into that now, so I don't have time, but I had a really quite abnormal childhood in terms of my development. That's why psychologists got involved, educational psychologists and special needs. So I clearly wasn't one of these people she's talking about. I had a pretty messed up childhood in terms of all the problems I had. Other conditions, not necessarily neurodevelopmental, that make you more vulnerable to certain stresses, she said, maybe make you more anxious. For example, in unpredictable social situations, a therapy might help this person, which would never help a person with a childhood history. And she also talks about differences between nerdy personality type, this an identity, she says, and wrong to pathologise. You just have an eccentric, wonderful personality. There's nothing wrong with you. You need to move beyond purely subjective reports of, I'm very impaired. She said you need others' view on this and objective replicated tests. And she talks about limited resources that have to be distributed wisely and fairly. That old cookie. I don't really agree with her there. I won't go into it now, my own thoughts. I'm just telling you what she said, okay, so you can make your own mind up. I can talk about my own views another time. She talks about how big data is very noisy and we need instead ideas that have to be tested. Okay, so that's basically what she said recently. So do let me know any of you your own thoughts. But some very controversial stuff there that I'm sure some of you will find very incendiary. I have mixed views on it. Some parts I kind of agree with, other parts I think she's going too far, and I think that she risks antagonising and alienating people who've been diagnosed for a reason, essentially. But do let me know what you think. So thank you for watching.